Hey, Kua.
Hey, Kendra.
We're back.
Y'all, we're back for another episode of the Black Gems Diving Podcast.
Yes, and we are live at Congressional Black Caucus in Washington, D.C. for our second year.
Yes. So, y'all know we came last year and had a really great conversation. Shout out to Miles Gresham. He joined us last year and had a discussion around Project 2025. We're back. We're back in DC, back in the mix, in the middle of everything.
And things feel very different.
Oh, absolutely.
I know when we were here, it was right before the election. We were talking about what could be.
Right.
And now we're seeing the progress of 2025. We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
And some of the things that's been happening recently.
Right.
And then also, too, about just the general state of DEI and where we are.
Yeah. So y'all know how we do. We're going to break this down into our normal segments. And so we're going to start with the diversity dispatch. And that's where we're looking at things in the DEI space, conversations that beg for us to have discussions around them, right? Yes. And so the first conversation is actually coming from The Independent. And the title is Hegseth shutters group that encourages women in the military as part of his anti-DEI push. And so Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has closed down a historic group that was created to boost the involvement of women in the military as part of an ongoing anti-DEI push within the armed forces. The committee is focused on advancing a divisive feminist agenda that hurts combat readiness, while Secretary Hegseth has focused on advancing uniform, sex-neutral standards across the department, spokeswoman Kingsley Wilson said Tuesday on X. And so just to give you some background around this specific committee, it was formed in 1951, and the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services is one of the oldest advisory committees in the department, providing recommendations that have been instrumental in affecting changes to laws and policies for military women. The group is composed of civilian women and men appointed by the Defense Secretary to provide advice and recommendations on matters related to the recruitment, retention, employment, integration, well-being, and treatment of women in the U.S. Armed Forces. And so we know that since its inception, the committee has submitted over 1,100 recommendations for consideration. And as of 2025, approximately 94% have either been fully or partially adopted by the department. And so we know also, right, like last year, there were conversations that kind of made headlines with Pete Hegseth. He came under fire for his views and remarks about the inclusion of women in the military. He was on a podcast last year, and prior to his confirmation to the role by the Senate, he said that the nation's military should not have women in combat roles and that men are more capable in these positions. He had previously told right-wing media personality Ben Shapiro that women are life givers, not life takers. During his confirmation hearing, however, he said he supported women in the military. So how do you feel about this?
Well, this is heavy because also too, I'm a person that looks at data, right? And I look at statistics, and statistics show that women are very influential.
Absolutely.
They are making headway and changes within the military as well. Sadly, also in this article talks about it's been a drop in what we're seeing in terms of women in the military, but it's also been a drop in general. Of people who have been going into our military and armed forces. We know that there has been some language change. There's been recommendation to change things to the defensive of the Department of War. Which also plays into the ethos of what you're seeing and feeling from our administration as well. And if they're saying that women are caregivers and not life takers, right? That does not play into the ethos of what they're saying. And so, unfortunately, we're seeing this backlash. But again, this is something that we've been tracking in Project 2025 too.
Absolutely. And I think, there was an article that talked about the importance of women in the military because there was specific wars that it called out and talked about how influential these women were because they kept their eye on the prize and they couldn't really be distracted by things like money, women, other things like that men did. And so they specifically called out how other men would be distracted and kind of go off of, their purpose as it related to that specific war. But the women were the ones who continue. Think about the 666
I was going to say
as
that,
well, right? Like there were a lot of groups.
And problem solvers. They were problem solvers.
Exactly. You know what I mean? So again, we talked about this last year. We're going to actually give y'all some updates around what has happened around Project 2025. We were kind of trying to beat the drum and get everyone to hear and listen like, hey, this is a threat. not only is it a threat to our everyday, but it's a threat to our democracy.
Absolutely.
And so now we have some reports on how far that has gone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I know normally when we're in the studio back at home in Buffalo, we can sit and chat
Y'all
and
know.
chew all day. But they give us 30 minutes, y'all. So we got to
Right.
keep going. But this is something, again, that we are going to continue to track as well. And also, too, just one thing to note, outside of just the laws when it comes to women, also there's been an attack on transgender.
Absolutely.
Within the military
Yep.
as well. And so that's another layer.
Mhm.
So that's something that to track.
Absolutely.
All right. So that was our deep dive. We have our hot topic, which is our next segment where we talk about something that has, again, happened recently. We want to talk about that's been in the media and the news. And I know everyone's been talking about Jimmy Kimmel.
Everybody.
And everyone has been talking about what's been happening. And so there is an article that I want to refer to from the Salon called That Backfired Bigly. Kimmel's return is a defeat for Project 2025. So it goes on to talk about before late night host Jimmy Kimmel returned to the air after he was suspended for what Disney, the owner of ABC, characterized as ill-timed and thus insensitive remarks about the killing of Charlie Kirk. President Donald Trump made it clear that the comedian was still at risk of government backlash. Trump took to Truth Social late Tuesday to condemn ABC's decision and suggest that Kimmel's return might amount to a, quote, illegal campaign contribution to the Democratic National Committee. He threatened to, quote, test ABC out on this, apparently alluding to a prior $60 million settlement paid by the network. And the White House was told by ABC that his show was canceled. Something happened between then and now, and the president complained. The show is not important, Kimmel told his audience upon his return Tuesday. What is important is that we get to live in a country that allows us to have a show like this. He continued by saying, our freedom to speak is what I admire most about this country. And that's something I'm embarrassed to say I took for granted until they pulled my friend Stephen Colbert off the air and tried to coerce the affiliates to run our show in the cities that you live in to take my show off of the air. And so we've all been following this story the past couple of days. We didn't know what was going to happen, but we know ultimately this is an attack on free speech and freedom and democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we're going to keep drawing the connections back to Project 2025, because again, we talked about it last year and we want to give you some updates. And so the person who actually wrote the chapter in Project 2025 is the current FCC chair. And that's Brennan Carr. And so he said, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And I kind of want to do my hand like, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Because he's been compared to like a mafioso, right? Like a mafia boss. Essentially, he threatened that a week ago, and it talked about his tactics directly mirrored those that he laid out as a contributor to Project 2025, using informal pressure backed by licensed review authority to guide content decisions without needing formal rulemaking. And that same next day, that's when Kimmel was yanked off the air. And so the conversations drew wide criticism. And I mean, you know, obviously on the left, there were a lot of criticisms, but also on the right as well. And you had, you know, famous podcasters like Joe Rogan who said, yeah, y'all, we shouldn't be happy about this because what happens if, you know, in 3.5 years,
when the pendulum,
when the pendulum changes or has a potential to change, that they do this back to then us, right? And so, I don't know. I think there's a lot of things to draw from this conversation. We also talked about just some of the, you know, inequities in terms of how things have moved so quickly. And so we've had conversations about how, you know, folks like Joy Reid, you know, her show was canceled and there were outrage about it, but there wasn't a movement.
It wasn't the same
in the same way,
the same outrage, right? You know, in the article it talks about Kimmel's return was a test. Is there still room in our media ecosystem for dissenting voices? You know, and that is a question. You know, especially what we talked about with Joy Reid, and you're talking about the movement and the energy behind it. You know, she was fired from MSNBC. She now has a Joy Reid podcast and show, which I argue is actually better than
honestly, because she's unfiltered.
She's unfiltered.
You know, she can say whatever she wants.
But it goes to show also too. We've been talking about this. There's folks like Roland Martin who's been saying, you know, support Black podcaster journalism. Put your dollars and money towards it as well, because what is happening is you're seeing a lot of people going independent. But they need the support to keep going as well. But going back to what we were saying, what Kimmel is again, there's privilege in him coming back.
Oh, for sure.
You know, there's a lot of privilege in that. And so within 2-3 days, he was back on air. and picked up right where he left off.
Exactly.
He said, what did he say again?
He was like, like I've been saying.
Like I've been saying.
Yeah, something of that notion. But yeah, I think it's something to watch, right? And there's always conversations around things like censorship or being canceled. And, in this case, and I don't know, hopefully folks have seen it, where the joke that he made wasn't even related directly to Charlie Kirk. It was the president's response to it. And so he had played a clip where the press had asked him, like, hey, your dear friend Charlie Kirk, who, helped to push a lot of conservative ideals on college campuses, was killed, and basically getting his take. And I think he acknowledged it.
Yeah, he said sad and what happened. But look at this construction.
Literally within seconds was like, oh, but did y'all see the construction over here in the White House and what I'm doing? And so he basically played that clip to say, like, just to show what the response was. And that is what, blew up and became such a conversation. And so it's interesting to me. There's a lot of outrage, obviously, but there's also a lot of selective outrage in terms of what has happened. We know, like, Melissa Hortman, who was killed in her own home, was a Democrat in Minnesota, and we didn't see the same level of outrage. And so it's just interesting. I think we have to be mindful of it. I think, every life is precious, but we also have to be considerate around, the notion of how folks have moved as well.
And we talk about divisiveness. Yesterday, we had a podcast back in our studio in Buffalo, and we had Dr. Janice Asari on our podcast, and she talked about the divisiveness and talked about how, due to social media and things like that, we are now in our own corners. We're talking about who owns the story, who owns the narrative. But is it time for us to come together? Because, we're all, most of us, majority of us, are a part of marginalized groups.
Absolutely.
In America. And so, when we're helping one group, we're helping all. And so we have to get back to that notion and understand that. But right now, where we are within our economy, within our political realm, we are so divided, and that is very tactful and purposeful as well.
And when you are divided, it falls a lot easier, right? And I think there was a meme that I saw where it was like, this big giant fat man who had cookies piled up on his plate. And then there were, like, you could see maybe a person of color over here, and there was like a white person over here, and the person of color had like a half a cookie on their plate, and the white person had crumbs. And the white person was pointing to the person of color, like, oh, you have my cookie, but here's, like, this big man in the middle with all the cookies. And the conversations are kind of happening in those divided groups, historically excluded groups, folks who live in, rural communities, folks who are, really challenged from an economic standpoint, people of color, women, etc. And I think it's just interesting because there's so many different intersections of the argument and what's happening. There's people who, are divided from that sense, but ultimately, it's also class as well. You're seeing people who have been rich become richer, and people at the margins continue to move further and further at the margins.
The have and have nots. And it's playing off of fear. And that's, and as we dive into, Project 2025, that's exactly what it is. It's based off of fear, and it's putting that into our communities. And so it's making us go into our little corners, and backing down on a lot of different things.
I mean, and we talked about the algorithms too, right? Because I think that there's some purposeful nature in how we are divided as well. Because like my algorithm says this, I'm going to stay on this side. Your algorithm's showing you that, and you're going to stay on that side. And we both think we're right. Confirmation bias based on what we're seeing on our phones. You know what I mean? So, child.
Yes. And this is only within the past week.
Right. Exactly.
So in our last couple of minutes together, we're going to actually talk about Project 2025. And as we said before, we were here last year. We were talking about what could be, right? At the time, Trump was running for president, and then he was going against Joe Biden.
Yes.
And shout out to Kamala Harris, her book just dropped. And I am in the process of reading it, 107 days. But at the time when we were here, it was Trump versus Biden, and Project 2025 was a thing. It was created by the Heritage Foundation, and so many people were asking Trump, does he know anything about it?
And he said no. Like, what is this?
He said, no, I have no idea what this is.
No idea. That's nonsense.
Yes, but now it's his playbook.
It's the playbook, and not only is it the playbook, the people who wrote this are now in the administration, right? So we talked about Brendan Carr, who is in charge of the FCC, who, like I said, the mob boss notion of we could do this the easy way or the hard way. Y'all need to cancel Jimmy Kimmel. And then the president who's saying, oh, well, I made $16 million off of this. This sounds more lucrative.
Exactly.
Let's see how, we fight this, right? And so all of this is coming back to Project 2025, which obviously has been the playbook for how the administration has gone about moving forward with legislation, and not even doing it from a standpoint of, having conversations and debate in Congress, but it's just doing it by executive
It's a copy
order,
and paste, and it's also been, again, strategic, putting people in place for years,
exactly,
and now they're just bubbling to the top. And so as we just talked about,
so we're going to our deep dive.
Yes, our deep dive. Yes, so our deep dive is Project 2025. There was an article by MSNBC that says a Trump appointee's post shows that Project 2025 was a plan all along. As we just talked about, for example, Commissioner Brendan Carr is one of the people who wrote the chapter for the FCC, who is now in that position. But it says on the campaign trail last year, Donald Trump swore he knew nothing about Project 2025. As a candidate, he said he didn't even know who had written the far right blueprint for a second term, called some of his ideas absolutely ridiculous, abysmal, and argued it was pure disinformation for Democrats to try to link him to that plan. In case it wasn't clear at the time, Trump was lying. Along with other journalists, and this is an opinion page, I try to make that as clear as possible during the campaign, noting the ties that Trump had with his authors, the track record the Heritage Fund had on getting his support for his ideas in his own previous remarks, as well as the fact that he had declined to say specifically which ideas in Project 2025's 900 pages he considered so ridiculous. When he won his second term, Trump dropped the pretense and began enacting Project 2025's proposal, in some cases to the letter. In the 8 months since inauguration, he has kicked off most of his major proposals. Some of them are launching a mass deportation program, which we see in real time, obviously, purging civil servants and replacing them with partisan loyalists, defending the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, reducing the Federal Emergency Management Agency's role in disaster response, eliminating federal DEI efforts, banning transgender troops in the military, which most of these we have hit talking about today in our short period of time.
Exactly.
And so there is a Project 2025 tracker that is out there, and it shows that it is almost 50% complete in 8 months.
And so I think another notion, right, in terms of how closely aligned this is, and like you said, the administration, Trump in the beginning said, no, I don't know anything about it, but he appointed the Project 2025 co-author, Russell Vought, as director of the Office of Management and Budget. He nominated contributor E.J. Antoni as commissioner of labor statistics, despite the latter's lack of the usual credentials. And the Senate has not voted on him yet, but he also appointed Brandon Carr, who we talked about, for FCC. And so for something to be so far and not aligned, you see that the people who wrote it are actually now in charge of the government and are also dismantling the government at a very rapid pace. And so now there's a conversation that's happening around like shutting down of the government. We at September 30th, so it's 5 days.
And who do you replace them with?
And so the conversation is, now you see the administration saying, you know what, if y'all don't pass this budget, if you don't keep the government open, we're going to use this as mass firings. And they can go in and literally slice and dice up the government even more than it was done already, right? Under, when Elon was, a special, I forgot what his title was.
Doge.
Doge, right, exactly. So we're seeing this happen in real time. There's real implications for what that looks like. But one of the conversations that we wanted to have is actually tie this back to Project 2025 is around, how much has actually changed. And so there's a tracker, y'all, that you can go online. It's project2025.observer. And when they talk about like the overall progress of all the things that Project 2025 said, it says that we're halfway through it. In 8 months.
In 8 months.
In 8 months.
Scary.
Which is very scary. And so it talks about, some of the things that, it has dismantled already. One of the things that we talked about was even the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. And so there were conversations in Project 2025 that said, hey, since Nixon and since Reagan, we've been trying to dismantle the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And it says that every Republican president since Richard Nixon has tried to strip the Corporation for Public Broadcasting of taxpayer funding.
Yeah.
And they talk about how it creates this echo chamber of liberal leaning and left leaning politics and conversations, and how we need to get rid of it because it's taxpayers who are paying for this, but it's not necessarily promoting our own viewpoints. And so there's an extensive list around like demonstrated pattern of bias that it talks about. And it talks about how many people who listen to it are actually on the left or more progressive. And so that was one of the things that was done. We saw the defunding happen of the public, Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And so what other elements are we seeing in this?
I mean, also to the USAGM, which is the U.S. Agency of Global Media, is one of the arms that they're attacking, in my opinion, the most. They have several objectives as it relates to that as well. Some of them are dismantling the firewall, to align in its reporting and the aims of the president. We're seeing that, there are suggestions of people to have certain passes to get into the White House for the media as well, to show a certain story or to tell a certain story. Again, we talk about the budget cuts, and then stop funding to the Open Technology Fund as well, which is an attempt to terminate that funding. And but what we are seeing is that some of the courts are blocking this. And so that was one that I was most recently following, where the court had blocked that in terms of terminating the technology fund. And these courts are working overtime.
Man, are they?
And so part of it too, what you're seeing with Project 2025 is, again, some people are getting paid to push things through, as well. And so it's the, balancing act, but then also too, like, people are getting paid to do some of these things. And for someone, I always joke around, like, remember the Schoolhouse Rock? We always talk about I'm just a bill. Is that even relevant anymore? Because
listen, I think that there's a lot of people that don't understand how their government works. I think we were talking about the meme where they were asking people like the 3 branches of the government, and people were struggling, y'all, like did not know the 3 branches and were making up things. But I think that just shows you, not only is general literacy a challenge in the United States, but literacy around how your government works is also being impacted as well. And so folks thinks it's all, jokes and games. You look at, your memes, but at the end of the day, this is really impacting people in real time. And so one of the things that I know under the Project 2025 tracker was the White House. It was under the White House notion, and that I think is 92% completed. And there's like 10 different factors that they were trying to do. But back in February, one of them was give political appointees the power to personally review and authorize appropriated funding. And we're seeing that that's shifting and changing in real time. Funding that was already appropriated by Congress is now being diverted into other areas. And we're in a position now where it's like, we don't know left from right, at the end of the day. We can't even plan for the future because things are shifting in real time on a regular basis.
So, we talk about like, we always say, where do we go from here? Because initially in the beginning of the year, we were just so exhausted, and we are, We're still exhausted. And I'm saying we still, and couldn't believe this is happening such at a rapid pace. But there are some conversations that are being had to say like, what's next, The most immediate thing I always say is education. Again, education of knowing how government works. We have midterm elections coming up next year. That is an immediate way to kind of change a little bit of what's happening, kind of maybe even slowing it down.
But then also, in our last podcast, we talked about election security being a conversation and things that people need to watch, because gerrymandering that's happening in a lot of the southern states will shift us even further from the possibility of having a fair election, And so we need to make sure that we're paying attention to that as well.
It's education. It's absolutely. It's education. And then also too, going back really quickly to our conversation we had yesterday with Dr. Asari, and saying again, where do we go from here? It is very hard to get lost in the sauce. It's very hard to get very discouraged. But one thing that we always say is keep looking back to our past.
Absolutely.
And keep looking back to some of these movements that have been successful, some of the movements that seem like it's just been so daunting and drawn out. And some of it is, again, it's still happening, but understand your role. What role do you play? Like she was talking about
the
baker. There was a woman who was a baker, who was a part of the Montgomery boycott, who sold baked goods to help with the boycott, to fund the boycott. And so again, you don't have to be in the streets. You don't have to be on social media. You don't have to be in the forefront, but maybe, it is the baking. Maybe it is education. Find your piece within the movement in order to keep it moving.
And I think we've seen this in our own spaces, right? And so I think about, the tragedy of 514 in Buffalo, and that's a conversation that we continue to have. That's when 10 folks were shot by white supremacist gunmen. on the east side of Buffalo, not too far from we actually record
literally
the podcast.
across the parking
literally
lot,
across the plaza, right? And so when we think about our roles and our ways of kind of moving things forward, I think about this past year and how, my team, we were just saying, we're going to create a space for Black joy. We're going to reclaim this and make sure that people know that we see you, you're loved. There's space for all of us in this movement. And I think we all have to find that, right? Yeah. And we can't ask for permission. We just got to do it, y'all, at this point in time. And also, I think one of the things that we have to also keep in mind is rest. Knowing when to rest your body, take a nap, restore yourself, because this is not a one and done thing. And I think a lot of the younger generations, us included, are just like, oh my gosh, I'm just disillusioned with what has happened so far. And instead of trying to keep ourselves going in this space, we just say, forget it, right? And kind of dust our hands off and lay down. Right. And so I'm not saying that you shouldn't lay down. I'm just saying, like, you have to find your ways of getting involved, being active in the space. Right. Because when you think about our ancestors and what they endured, it was a different time. Absolutely. Yes, we got memes. Yes, we got comments and things that we have to navigate. And there are larger things that are impacting us. But at the end of the day, we can't stop in terms of our motion and moving forward and keep moving that baton forward for the next generation. Yeah, I was going to say, no one's going to save us but us. Us, exactly. And that's what it comes down to. Exactly. And so take your rest, Kua. Yeah. And you take your rest too. Take your rest and do what you got to do. But to your point, and then also to, again, uplift your community. I will say too, since we're at CBC and we're on this platform, talk about a little bit in our last few minutes of what you did for 514 and finding joy within our community, because I think it was really good in the eyes of tragedy, finding joy, finding that community, finding people just to have a moment where they can celebrate themselves. So. Line dancing, y'all. And that's the thing, like, I think about somatics and I think about where we come from, and moving your body is really important to do so, right? And so when you find community and spaces, you can kind of let your shoulders down a little bit, right? Like, instead of keeping them hunched up with all this on your back that you're carrying. And so I think moments like 514 this past year, Day of Service and Remembrance, we came together to volunteer and to give back in our community. And then we also created space where we could find absolute joy. And so I think, one of the conversations we talked about is like, what's next for DEI? A lot of people are saying like DEI is dead, but it's really not dead. We're reframing it. We've always reframed it for years. Always had to, right? And so I think it is finding community. It's going back to the roots, the basics of, talking to your neighbor, finding out how they're doing, right? Like asking them, how can I help you? Community. Being involved in that way. And so we can't stop at this juncture. We got to keep going. We got to keep going. We have no other choice but to. I always say that. As much as we want to take a nap, which we will sometimes, but we have no other choice to. Right. So I'm going to pass it to you. So our last segment is the gem of the day, in which we always highlight something, whether it's a quote or something that's positive. So I'm going to pass it to you of your gem of the day. Yeah. So when I think about my gem of the day, and I think, the last one I talked about, like, finding community, I think I want to talk about finding purpose, right? And so we often get lost in the sauce on your everyday. There's always something happening and something going on, but find your purpose and your connection to this work. We can't stop. I often talk about ancestors and how we're standing on top of their shoulders, and we're always going to be, kind of thinking about our future. Afrofuturism, we talk about that as well, because you have to envision a future that's different from your current reality, because if you only focus on your current reality, it's really difficult to kind of lose sight of that vision and what moves forward. So connect with one another, find your purpose in this space. Get youth involved, y'all. Bring the youth as a part of the conversation and discussion, because we're doing all of this for them. And so that's my gem of the day. You just took my okay. Oh no. This is how we're always like so connected. But my gem of the day was about the youth. Okay. And so for me, again, like, we can't do it alone. We have to bring the youth. I mean, when you look at these movements and when you look at people who are in the movement, they were the youth, right? When you're looking at John Lewis, when you're looking at MLK, like, they weren't. It's not like they popped up in the internet. They were young, involved in this movement. Exactly. So get the youth involved, because they have a voice, they have a purpose, they have a place. Right. And I love hearing from them because they're so creative. And also too, I think this next generation is also unapologetic. Absolutely. Right. They are so diverse. Yeah. They don't care about all this stuff sometimes that's happening, and so that gives me hope. I hope they don't get tainted, but that does give me hope. So bring the youth involved, bring them to conferences like this or CBC, bring them to the table, bring up a seat, as our girl Shirley Chisholm says,
So
and
yeah,
put them on boards too.
Put them on boards.
You know what
Sponsor
I mean?
them.
Exactly. Sponsor them. Invest in them because of the future. And we often talk about, look, I ain't trying to be 65, 70, 75 still in the same position and place. So let's make sure that we're mentoring them, not gatekeeping.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Creating space specifically for them to get involved in this movement because it's necessary. It takes all of us.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely. All right. So normally, y'all, we be chatting for like a good 45 minutes to an hour at home.
Exactly.
But Sis said we on the clock right here. But no, I appreciate it. And I appreciate you guys tuning in this space. So you can find us on Black Gems Dive In Podcast, Apple, Spotify, anywhere that you get your podcast. YouTube. We are on YouTube.
Yes.
And then also to Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.
And DM us and let us know what you want to hear and what you want us to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Another episode's in the books.
Another episode for Black Gems Dive In Podcast. Peace, y'all.